For 10 years, nothing really changed on this street. Same houses, same quiet evenings. I'd sit right here with a cup of coffee, watching the same empty road. Until one evening, someone moved into that house across the street. At first, I didn't think much about it. Just another neighbor moving into the empty house across the street. But something about that evening felt different.
For 10 years I lived in a house that sounded wrong. Not broken. Not empty the way people imagine. Just too quiet for a man who once had someone waiting in the kitchen every morning. The hardest part about losing your wife isn't the funeral. People bring casseroles, shake your hand, tell you they're sorry. The house fills with voices for a few hours. The hardest part is the first ordinary morning after everyone leaves. You wake up. The coffee machine clicks on. The sun comes through the same kitchen window it always has. And then it hits you that the person who used to stand across that counter from you is simply not there anymore. My name is Tom Walker. I'm 61 years old, and for the past 10 years I've lived alone in a small town in Pennsylvania. The kind of place where the same hardware store has been on Main Street for 40 years and people still wave when they pass you in a pickup truck. Most of my life I worked as a mechanic. Engines always made sense to me. If something broke, you could take it apart, find the bad piece, replace it. People aren't like that. Life definitely isn't. After Mary died, my days slowly turned into routines. Not plans. Just routines. Every morning I'd make coffee in the same chipped mug Mary bought me about 20 years ago. Brown ceramic, ugly as sin. She used to joke that it looked like something you'd win at a gas station raffle. Truth is, she only bought it because it reminded her of me. I still use it. I'd sit at the kitchen table, listen to an old radio station that mostly played country songs from the 70s, and stare out the same window we used to look through together. After that I'd head out to the garage. The garage became my way of staying busy. Old lawnmowers, neighbors' trucks, tools that didn't really need fixing but got fixed anyway. When you work with engines long enough, you learn something simple: noise is better than silence. Evenings were quieter. I'd sit on the wooden porch with another cup of coffee and watch the street. Same houses. Same trees. Same rhythm of cars passing every now and then. After a while the quiet stops feeling lonely. It just becomes normal. The house across the street had been empty for nearly a year. The previous couple moved to Florida after retiring. Around here houses don't sell fast unless they're brand new, and that one definitely wasn't. Then one afternoon a moving truck pulled up. I noticed it mostly because the driver parked halfway onto the curb like he'd never driven through a small town before. I was standing in my garage at the time, leaning over the hood of my truck. I bent over the engine like I suddenly had something very important to fix. Truth is, I was just pretending to be busy. When I looked up again, I saw her. She stepped out of the passenger side of the truck carrying a small cardboard box. Mid-50s, maybe. Brown hair pulled back loosely. Nothing flashy about her. Simple clothes. Calm posture. She looked around the street slowly, like someone measuring a place before deciding if they belonged there. Then she carried the box inside. That evening I noticed something else. She was sitting on her porch. A book in her hands. Every now and then she'd look up from the pages and watch the sun drop behind the trees at the end of the street. For the next few evenings, the same quiet routine repeated itself. Me on my porch. Her on hers. Two strangers sharing the same stretch of quiet road. I didn't think much about it at first. When you live alone long enough, you stop getting involved in other people's lives. People come and go. They wave once or twice. Sometimes they borrow a ladder. That's usually the end of it. Still, I caught myself watching the porch across the street more often than I wanted to admit. Not in a strange way. Just curiosity. It had been a long time since another life existed that close to mine. About a week after she moved in, something happened that changed the rhythm of those evenings. I was sitting in my usual chair with my coffee when I noticed she wasn't reading. She was looking across the street. Not at the trees. Not at the sky. At me. I glanced down quickly, pretending to adjust my sleeve. A few seconds passed. Then I heard a voice. Tom! I froze. Not because she spoke. Because she knew my name. I looked up slowly. She was leaning lightly against the porch railing, her book closed in one hand. She wasn't angry. If anything, she looked amused. You know I can see you watching from over there, she said. My face probably turned the color of a brake light. Before I could come up with anything intelligent to say, she added something that caught me completely off guard. If you want to talk to me, you don't have to do it from across the street. Then she opened her book again like the conversation was finished, and sat back down. The street went quiet. I stayed there in my chair for a long minute, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. And for the first time in 10 years, I found myself standing at a small but very real crossroads. I could stay exactly where I was. Same porch. Same chair. Same quiet life I'd been living for a decade. Or I could stand up, walk across that street, and talk to the woman who somehow already knew my name. I sat there another minute, staring at the house across from mine. And the strange thing was, for the first time in a long while, the street didn't feel quite as quiet as it used to. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Not because of the alarm. I've been waking up before alarms for years now. That's what happens when you get older and when your house gets too quiet. Your body stops trusting sleep the way it used to. But that morning felt different. For 10 years my mornings had followed the same quiet routine. Coffee. Radio. Silence. A man can get used to almost anything if he repeats it long enough. But now there was something else sitting in the back of my mind. A woman across the street who knew my name. I stood in the kitchen holding my coffee mug and staring through the window toward her house. The porch was empty. The chair she'd been sitting in the night before was still there, but the door behind it was closed. For a moment I thought about what had happened the evening before. You don't have to talk to me from across the street. She'd said it so casually, like she'd been waiting for me to figure that out. Most people probably would have walked over right then. But most people don't spend 10 years learning how to live alone. I took a sip of coffee and looked at the clock on the microwave. 6:42 a.m. Too early to bother someone. Too early to make a fool of yourself. Still, the thought stuck with me. I tried to shake it off and headed out to the garage like I always did. The smell of oil and metal greeted me the way it had for decades. Familiar things have a way of calming a man down. I lifted the hood of my old Ford pickup and stared at the engine like it had personally offended me. Truth was, the truck ran fine. I just needed something to do with my hands. About half an hour later I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. At first I assumed it was one of the neighbors. Then I heard a voice. Morning, Tom. I turned around a little too fast and bumped my elbow against the hood. Sarah Mitchell stood near the entrance of the garage with a paper bag in one hand. Up close she looked about the same as she had from across the street. Calm. Observant. The kind of person who seemed comfortable standing in silence. She held the bag out toward me. I figured you might like breakfast, she said. There's a bakery about 10 minutes from here. Inside the bag were 2 muffins and a small container of coffee. I must have looked confused because she gave a small smile. You look like a man who drinks coffee on his porch every morning. I cleared my throat. Well, I do. For a moment neither of us said anything. The radio inside the garage hummed softly in the background, playing an old Willie Nelson song. She glanced around the garage. You've been a mechanic a long time, she said. It wasn't a question. 35 years. I replied. She nodded slowly, like that piece of information fit into something she already knew. That feeling again. Like she knew more about me than she should. We sat on 2 old stools near the workbench and ate the muffins in comfortable silence for a minute. I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my head since the night before. How'd you know my name? She took a sip of her coffee before answering. Small town, she said. People talk. That explanation didn't fully convince me, but I let it go. After a few minutes she stood up and brushed the crumbs from her hands. "Well," she said, "I should let you get back to pretending that truck needs fixing." I laughed despite myself. She had caught me. She started walking back toward the street, then stopped and turned slightly. "You know," she said, "you're not the only one who sits on a porch watching the same quiet street every night." I wasn't sure what to say to that. So I said the first honest thing that came to mind. "I guess we're both creatures of habit." She nodded. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe we're both just people who forgot how to start conversations." Then she gave a small wave and walked back across the street. I watched her reach her porch and disappear inside the house. The garage suddenly felt quiet again. I stood there for a while staring at the half-open hood of the truck. 10 years ago, talking to someone new would have been simple. Now it felt like learning how to walk again after sitting too long. I could already feel the old instinct returning. The safe one. Stay in the garage. Stay on the porch. Stay in the life you already understand. But then I remembered something Mary used to say when I'd spend too many hours working. "Tom," she'd tell me, "one day you're going to look up and realize life kept happening while you were busy fixing things." I wiped my hands on an old rag and looked toward the street. The porch across from mine was empty again. And I found myself wondering something I hadn't wondered in a long time. What would happen if this time I didn't wait 10 years to walk across the street again? About 3 days after Sarah brought those muffins to my garage, I realized something uncomfortable. I was starting to look forward to the evenings again. That might not sound like much to most people, but when you've spent 10 years living the same quiet routine, even a small change can feel like someone moved the furniture in your mind. For a decade my evenings had been predictable. Coffee on the porch. Watch the street. Listen to the crickets. Go inside when the air got cold. But now there was a second porch across the road. And sometimes there was a woman sitting on it. The strange part was, we didn't even talk most nights. Sometimes we just sat there. 2 people in 2 chairs, about 30 feet apart, sharing the same sunset. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Just neighbors being polite. Still, I found myself noticing things. Sarah read real books. The kind with worn covers and folded pages. She didn't scroll through her phone the way younger folks do. She drank tea in the evenings instead of coffee. And every once in a while she'd look up from her book and watch the sky the way people do when they're remembering something. I noticed that look because I'd seen it before. Mary used to look at the sky like that. One evening I was sitting on my porch with my usual mug when Sarah suddenly stood up and walked down the steps of her porch. For a second I thought she was heading somewhere. Instead, she crossed the street. I straightened in my chair like a kid caught doing something wrong. She stopped at the edge of my yard. "You always sit in that exact chair?" she asked. "Pretty much," I said. She nodded toward the empty chair beside me. "Mind if I join you?" That question shouldn't have been difficult. But after 10 years of living alone, even small changes feel like big ones. I hesitated. Just a second. Then I heard myself say, "Sure." She sat down slowly and looked out toward the street. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The evening air smelled like cut grass and distant barbecue smoke from someone's backyard down the block. Finally she said something unexpected. "You've done a good job keeping this place together." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She gestured lightly toward the house. "Yard's clean. Porch is solid. Paint's not peeling. That's not easy for someone living alone." I shrugged. "Just maintenance." She gave a small smile. "Some people stop maintaining things when they're alone." That sentence sat in the air for a second longer than it should have. I didn't know how to answer it. So I changed the subject. "You settling into the neighborhood okay?" "Slowly," she said. "New towns take time." I nodded. That part one understood. After a minute she asked another question. "Do you still talk about her?" The words hit me before I even realized what she meant. "Mary," she added gently. I stared out toward the street for a moment. Not much, I admitted. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked toward the trees at the end of the road. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She used to laugh when she talked about you. My head turned toward her. What? Sarah seemed to realize what she had just said. For a brief second, something changed in her expression. Like someone who had opened a door a little too early. You knew Mary? I asked slowly. She looked down at her hands. Then back at me. A little, she said. That answer didn't feel complete. Not even close. How? I asked. She took a slow breath. Tom, sometimes people cross paths in ways that are harder to explain than they should be. That wasn't an answer. And she knew it. But she didn't say anything else. We sat there quietly for another minute. The sky had turned orange over the trees. Cars passed once or twice down the street. Finally, Sarah stood up. I should head back, she said. Before she walked away, she paused at the edge of the porch. Then she said something quietly. You know, she worried about you. The words hit harder than I expected. After she crossed the street and disappeared inside her house, I stayed there on the porch long after the sun had gone down. For 10 years I had managed to keep Mary's memory in a place that didn't interfere with the rest of my life. But now a stranger across the street had just opened that door again. And for the first time since she died, I found myself asking a question I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer to. How exactly did Sarah Mitchell know my wife? The next morning I woke up with a thought that wouldn't leave me alone. For 10 years I had managed to keep Mary's memory in a quiet corner of my life. Not hidden, exactly. Just undisturbed. Like a photograph on a shelf that you pass every day but rarely stop to study. But now something had changed. A woman across the street had just spoken about my wife like she knew her. Not like someone repeating a story they heard from neighbors. She spoke about Mary the way people do when they've actually stood in the same room together. And that question followed me out of bed, into the kitchen, and all the way through my first cup of coffee. How did Sarah Mitchell know my wife? I tried to do what I always did when something bothered me. Ignore it. I went out to the garage, lifted the hood of the truck, and stared down into the engine like the answer might be hiding somewhere between the radiator and the fan belt. It wasn't. About 20 minutes later I heard tires crunch slowly over gravel. When I stepped outside, a silver SUV had parked along the curb near Sarah's house. A tall man stepped out. Well-dressed. Maybe mid-60s. Gray hair that looked a little too perfect, like he still cared a lot about how people saw him. He walked up Sarah's driveway with the confidence of someone who expected doors to open for him. I pretended to keep working, but I watched out of the corner of my eye. Sarah answered the door after a moment. The two of them spoke briefly, then disappeared inside. Something about the whole thing sat wrong with me. Not jealousy exactly. Just curiosity. About an hour later they came back outside together. The man laughed at something she said. Loud laugh. The kind meant to be heard from across the street. He shook her hand before leaving, but the handshake lasted a little longer than most. When he finally got back into the SUV and drove away, Sarah stood on the porch watching the car disappear down the street. For a moment she looked tired. Then she glanced across the road and noticed me standing beside the garage. Instead of pretending she hadn't seen me, she walked straight toward my yard. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out from under the garage roof. Morning, she said. Morning. She followed my eyes toward the road where the SUV had disappeared. Old friend, she said casually. Looked like more than that, I replied before I could stop myself. She raised an eyebrow. You watching my visitors now? Just observant, I said. For a second I thought she might laugh. Instead she leaned lightly against the side of the garage and crossed her arms. You want to ask something, Tom, she said. I hesitated. 10 years of quiet living teaches you not to ask questions that might open doors you're not ready to walk through. But the question had already been sitting in my chest since the night before. So I asked it. How did you know, Mary? The air seemed to shift slightly between us. Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked down at the gravel, nudging a small stone with the tip of her shoe. When she finally looked back up, the calm expression she usually carried had changed. Not nervous. Just serious. You really want to know? She asked. I nodded. For a moment I thought she might tell me right there in the driveway. Instead she said something unexpected. Not out here. She glanced toward my porch. Sit with me tonight, she said. On your porch. After dinner. Why tonight? Because, she said quietly, once you hear it, things won't feel the same anymore. She pushed away from the garage and started walking back across the street. Halfway up her driveway she turned. And Tom. Yeah? When Mary talked about you, she always smiled first. Then she went inside. I stood there in the driveway long after the door closed. The garage behind me suddenly felt smaller than it had a few minutes before. For 10 years my life had been quiet and predictable. But now there was a woman across the street who knew things about my wife that I didn't understand. And tonight she was going to tell me why. The strange part wasn't that I was nervous. The strange part was realizing I had a choice. I could stay inside the life I'd built over the past decade. Keep the past where it was. Or I could sit on that porch tonight and hear something that might change the way I remembered the last years of my wife's life. I looked across the street at Sarah's house. One light had turned on in the living room window. And for the first time since Mary died, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Not fear. Anticipation. I spent the entire afternoon trying to pretend it was a normal day. It wasn't. Every small thing felt different once Sarah said those words that morning. Once you hear it, things won't feel the same anymore. That sentence followed me everywhere. I tried working in the garage. I lifted the hood of the truck, checked the same hose twice, wiped tools that were already clean. The radio played softly in the background, but I couldn't tell you a single song that came on. My mind kept drifting back to Mary. To the last year of her life. Hospitals. Quiet conversations. The way she used to squeeze my hand when the doctors walked out of the room. The way she always smiled even when I could see the fear behind it. There are memories you pack away because they're too heavy to carry every day. And now someone across the street had just told me she had been there. By late afternoon the sun had started sliding down behind the houses, painting the street in that soft, golden light small towns get before evening. Normally that was the part of the day I looked forward to. Porch. Coffee. Quiet. But that evening the quiet felt different. I sat in my usual chair and waited. For a long time nothing happened. Then, right around sunset, I heard footsteps crossing the street. Sarah walked up the small path to my porch carrying something in her hands. An envelope. She didn't say anything at first. Just sat down in the chair beside mine and looked out at the street the way we both often did. For a few minutes neither of us spoke. Finally she handed me the envelope. "This is why I moved here," she said quietly. I looked down at it. My name was written on the front. Tom. Not printed. Written in handwriting I recognized immediately. My chest tightened. "That's Mary's handwriting," I said. Sarah nodded. "She asked me to give it to you someday." I stared at the envelope for a long moment. "When?" I asked. Sarah folded her hands together in her lap. "The last week she was in the hospital." The street was quiet except for the distant hum of a car passing somewhere down the road. "She knew," Sarah continued gently. "She knew she wasn't going to make it." I swallowed. "That wasn't a secret." "No," Sarah said. "But what she was worried about wasn't dying." She paused. "She was worried about you." The words hit harder than I expected. Sarah looked out toward the trees at the end of the street as she spoke. "She told me about you. About your garage. About how you never complained. About how you always tried to fix everything." A small smile touched Sarah's face. "She said you were the most stubborn man she had ever loved." That sounded like Mary. I turned the envelope over slowly in my hands. Why didn't you give this to me before? I asked. Sarah hesitated. She told me not to. I looked at her. She said if I ever ran into you again, I should wait until I thought you were ready. Ready for what? Sarah met my eyes. For the part where you start living again. For a moment neither of us said anything. The sun dipped lower, and the evening air cooled around the porch. Finally I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. My hands weren't shaking exactly, but they weren't steady either. I unfolded it slowly. The first line made my throat tighten immediately. Tom, if you're reading this, it means I was right about one thing. You're probably still sitting in that quiet house pretending you're fine. I had to stop reading for a second. That was exactly something Mary would write. I continued. Listen to me. You are not meant to spend the rest of your life alone. You've always been better at fixing engines than fixing your own heart, but someday someone is going to walk into your life again. When that happens, don't push them away because of me. Love them. Laugh again. Sit on that porch with someone beside you. And if she drinks your coffee or steals your ugly mug, let her. My vision blurred slightly before I reached the last line. I had my chapter with you. Now you deserve another one. Mary. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. For a long time neither Sarah nor I spoke. Finally I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I didn't move here because she asked me to take care of you, Sarah said softly. I looked at her. I moved here because she talked about you like you were the best part of her life. She paused. And I wanted to see the man she loved. The streetlights flickered on one by one along the road. I looked out at the quiet neighborhood I had been living in for 10 years. Same houses. Same porch. Same evening air. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time in a decade, the quiet didn't feel like something I had to protect. It felt like something I could share. I looked at Sarah. You know, I said slowly, Mary was right about one thing. What's that? I glanced toward the empty chair beside me. Then back at her. This porch does look better when someone else is sitting on it. Sarah smiled. And for the first time in 10 years, the evening didn't feel lonely anymore.